Hello, everybody. We will go ahead and get started. My name is Jenny Carney. I'm a Senior Vice President with WSP USA's Sustainability, Energy, and Climate Change team. And I'm joined here today by some wonderful collaborators from Microsoft. They'll have a chance to introduce themselves in a few minutes. And today we're going to talk about some work that we've been collaborating together with many others, as well as the team here, on integrating environmental justice into corporate power purchase agreements that bring new renewable energy online with local and equitable co-benefits. The collaborators who are joining me include Anjali and Danielle from Microsoft's Renewable Energy team, and they will have a chance to give more information about their background in a moment. And before we hand things over to them to deliver the bulk of the presentation, we'll be online for 45 minutes, 30 minutes of presentation, and then 15 minutes of question and answer. You can place your questions in the question box and we'll address them towards the end of the presentation. And you can also access the slides and the lessons learned white paper in the handout box. So we really want to showcase some tools that are freely available to leverage in your own project work today. And so the intention is to, cover how voluntary corporate sustainability commitments drive new infrastructure development, how those long-term forward procurement contracts can provide opportunities for local and equitable co-benefits, and again, to showcase those models and tools for optimizing new infrastructure development for environmental justice outcomes. Before Anjali and Danielle move into their presentation, I wanted to share a little bit about the Sustainability, Energy, and Climate Change team in the US. We are a specialty practice that focuses on providing consulting and advisory services across the sustainability spectrum. Much of this is in the greenhouse gas accounting and emissions reduction planning arena, but we also support clients in water stewardship, zero waste and circularity, renewable energy procurement, and a number of other special niche subject areas around sustainability transition planning. We have around 120 different clients that we work with. Many of them are large corporate entities like Microsoft, but we also work with some municipalities, higher education institutions, and so on. And the inspiration for some of this work with Microsoft is actually rooted in another client that I've worked closely with. One of the things that I really appreciate about being able to work with so many different entities is the accelerated learning and the transference of insights and models into new spaces to really accelerate good outcomes in the realm of sustainability and resilience. And I'm Chicago-based. I have had the good fortune to be a partner to the city of Chicago in their own renewable energy strategy and their climate action planning. And as a city, they were really motivated to pay careful attention to what local constituents were looking for out of the clean energy transition. And there are a lot of environmental justice kind of community groups within the city that had a really clear vision about how they wanted communities and neighborhoods to benefit from these investments in renewable energy and other climate action. And in helping them with procuring their own renewable energy, a really interesting approach took shape where the city was willing to give equal weight to the extent to which proposals for new supply yielded local and equitable co-benefits. You know, even if it increased pricing, even if it sort of changed the actual physical approach to the development, they really wanted to prioritize that on equal footing, which is a pretty ambitious, I think, honoring of the sort of people side of people, planet, and profit for sustainable outcomes. Also woven into their new climate action plan is a really careful consideration of how various climate actions might deliver benefits to everyday people, or how it might actually add to burdens that are already being concentrated in some neighborhoods. And this learning with the city of Chicago became really relevant as I started working with Danielle at Microsoft in bringing some of these ideas of adding to voluntary corporate sustainability commitments a very kind of heavy and well-informed lens for how to drive social benefits as well as to provide environmental benefits. And when it comes to the renewable energy development sector, this is a really important opportunity to engage corporate buyers because they are so instrumental in driving demand for new renewable energy infrastructure development. This graphic shows the rise of corporate power purchase agreements, or PPAs. They actually first started in 2008, but have experienced near exponential growth over the last 8 to 10 years, where private companies with voluntary commitments are far outpacing conventional utilities or other buyers of renewables, meaning those same companies have a strong ability to influence how these projects happen and the extent to which communities benefit from these projects. So with that, I will hand it over to Danielle Decatur and Anjali Balakrishna from Microsoft.
Terrific. Thanks so much for that teeing up, Jenny. It's so nice to be here with everybody. My name is Anjali Balakrishna. I'm a program manager at Microsoft on our energy and environmental justice team, and I'm based in Atlanta, Georgia. Before I get into some slides, I'm going to hand it over to Danielle to introduce herself a bit.
Great. Thanks, Anjali, and thank you, Jenny, for having us today. I'm Danielle Decatur. I lead our environmental justice program along with Anjali and our teammate, David Stallworth, who's not on the call today. And I'll just orient you all to where we sit within Microsoft. Microsoft is a rather large company, and our team, the environmental justice team, is located in the renewable energy team. And the renewable energy team is located in the data center infrastructure group. And we function as sort of a center of expertise for environmental justice. And we started our journey incorporating environmental justice into our renewable energy strategy first, because that's one of the most significant sustainability goals that Microsoft has. We have other sustainability goals as well, which we will talk about in a moment. Back to you, Anjali.
Okay, great. Jenny, can you go to the next slide? So I'm going to start by sharing a little bit about what we mean when we say environmental justice and how we've internally messaged the importance of environmental justice to our sustainability goals. And then Danielle will take it away to share a little bit, to share some more specifics of the work we've done, the history of the program, and some of those models that Jenny mentioned at the top of the hour. So when we think about how to go about learning about environmental justice, the first step is really to acknowledge the past and present harms that communities have faced due to disproportionate exposure to industrial and other types of pollution. And so when we start by acknowledging that those past and present harms, then the next step is to say, okay, how do we redirect leadership, resources, and decision-making to communities that have been disproportionately impacted to ensure that they, as you see in the last point, are both equitably protected from environmental risk and, importantly, equitably empowered to participate in the decision-making processes that could affect them. So, to boil it all down, this idea really here is that folks who are most impacted by particular issues should be at the forefront of solving those problems. And when we think about learning about environmental justice, that idea is really at the core. Jenny, can you go to the next slide? And so, of course, the impacts of environmental injustice are uneven. On this slide, you'll see some statistics about the disproportionality as it relates to Black and African American communities here in the United States. So On the side of inequitably exposed to harm, Black and African American communities are exposed to over 1.5 times as much hazardous fossil fuel pollution compared to their white counterparts, regardless of wealth in this country. They tend to pay 3 times more for household energy as a percentage of income, a concept that you may have heard called energy burden. And yet, despite this disproportionate exposure, they are also disproportionately underrepresented in the energy industry and in reaping the benefits of the energy transition as it's unfolding. And so a few statistics that are relevant here: Black and African Americans tend to hold just about 1% of energy sector jobs, and even more shockingly, have access to 0.01% of energy sector profits. And so while there's this incredible movement transition happening across the world to shift to renewable energy, those benefits are not as of yet being equitably distributed and enjoyed by folks regardless of background. Now, these numbers, these statistics are US centric. And as I'll talk a little bit more in the next slide about who the different populations are that are most affected by environmental injustice. This looks different in different parts of the world. So get into a couple of definitions here. So I think one thing that's important to note here, Danielle and I and our teammate David didn't come up with these definitions. These definitions we have learned and gotten through our partnerships with a number of environmental justice advisors who have helped us shape our understanding and our learning. So you see that definition of environmental justice comes from a group called the Just Transitions Power Force. It's been an incredibly important group of advisors for us as we've been shaping our own understanding of environmental justice and figuring out what that looks like in the context of Microsoft. And so that definition, you'll see a lot of the points that I mentioned earlier about acknowledging past and present harms, understanding that folks should be equitably protected and equitably empowered to participate in decision-making, redirecting leadership, resourcing, etc. You may have also heard the term just transition. We find that just transition is actually often more commonly used in international contexts than environmental justice. You may hear climate justice, you may hear a just transition, but this is really about shifting from an extractive economy to a regenerative economy that's more inclusive. And to the point I made earlier on the previous slide, the communities that are most impacted by environmental injustice vary from location to location, depending on the historical context, the local dynamics, the political environment. And so the term frontline communities, can refer to folks who have been most proximate to and most impacted by industrial pollution, toxic factories, fossil fuel refineries, oil drilling, etc. And the priority populations being the communities that are sort of the primary beneficiaries, primary participants in environmental justice initiatives. So just an example, my family's from India, and when you think about who the priority populations are for environmental justice interventions in India, it's not necessarily based on race, but rather it may be more based on class or caste, or even rural-urban divide. So, for example, air pollution is a big issue in India, but rural women low-income rural women are sort of disproportionately impacted by indoor air pollution because they tend to be burning biomass and coal inside their homes, getting greater exposure to those sorts of air pollutions and toxins compared to other folks who have different access to different cooking equipment. Next slide, Jenny. And so before we get into the exciting parts that Danielle will share about what we've been doing, this is just a little bit of context about why we see environmental justice as sort of central to our values at Microsoft. So we love this quote from our CEO, Satya Nadella. He said this when we announced a big racial equity initiative in 2020, so that we have a responsibility to use our resources intentionally to address systemic inequities in our communities and in society broadly. So Jen, you can go to the next slide. And so, we really see environmental justice sitting at the nexus of several commitments that Microsoft has already made to environmental sustainability, to racial equity, to diversity and inclusion. So when we're talking about this internally, we're able to say, environmental justice as a concept sits right at this Venn diagram of things that Microsoft is already very, very committed to. And I think in other companies that capacity to take existing commitments and to show how environmental justice fits in, I think is an important part about getting that messaging across and building that case internally. So, our CEO has said it that we have an obligation, a commitment, an opportunity to use our investments, our technology, our intellectual capital to drive that sort of systemic change and build a more just and equitable future. So next slide. And so finally, before we turn to what we've been doing, I think it's really important to note that it's very possible to have a strong sustainability program and initiatives that don't incorporate environmental justice. But when you do that, you risk not engaging under-resourced communities and resulting in a sort of a lack of credibility of your initiatives, but more importantly, economic disenfranchisement of populations and not addressing the most acute problems. And so, you know, for example, so Microsoft has a strong sustainability set of commitments. We aim to be carbon negative, water positive, zero waste, and to preserve more land than we use. So that kind of fits into these 4 columns. But as you can see here, there are ways you can address those goals with environmental justice and without. And so most of the examples we'll provide later on will be more in the carbon space. So a water example, you know, is you could pursue a water replenishment conservation strategy that focuses on privatizing the water filtration systems, which may result in more clean water available, but that process may undermine municipal solutions and actually be inequitable. A water approach that has environmental justice sort of baked in would look at, okay, what are the levers that exist and that we can help create to increase equitable access to drinking water for everyone, particularly for under-resourced communities, and then seek solutions with that frame as opposed to you know, a solution that may privatize the system and undermine more equitable access. So that's a little bit about, and I guess the last thing I'll say is not only you know, does not engaging under-resourced communities result in, you know, not addressing the most acute problems, it can actually have material negative and harmful impacts, or business impacts, by not incorporating environmental justice. So, you know, for example, we've seen recently organizations that may be building renewable energy infrastructure, but not adequately engaging the local communities, and then having to, you know, decommission those projects because they didn't do the appropriate diligence along the way. So not only are we not addressing the most acute problems, but not doing this can have, you know, a material business impact. So with that, I'll turn it over to Danielle to talk a little bit about our environmental justice program so far and what we've been up to.
Perfect. Thank you, Anjali. So this slide shows a little bit about our journey so far. As Anjali mentioned, the foundation of our program is a learning approach and partnering with external organizations that have deep expertise in history and track record in addressing environmental injustice. And an example is the Just Transition Power Force, which is a network of environmental justice advisors to help identify key criteria for Microsoft in directing EJ investments. And I also want to acknowledge the extremely pivotal role that WSP has played in this strategy. Jenny Carney, I often say she's the other half of my brain. And we launched this program together, the concept beginning in 2019. And then also I want to acknowledge Ashwini Arun, Rafael Mboyo Engele, Brendan Denker, and Tara Early as key contributors to this strategy, as well as a host of other folks in their consulting practice. So when we started in 2020, we started very small with just a workshop, and that workshop helped us start to gain fluency in EJ issues starting in the US. And again, we started in the US because that's where the bulk of our renewable energy procurement was at the time. And we were able to operationalize our learnings through the power purchase agreement we signed with Soul Systems at 500 megawatts, which is quite large. And we'll talk a little bit about the structure of that agreement and the Volt Energy Utility Agreement that we later signed in 2021 with Volt Energy Utility at 250 megawatts. And the collaboration with environmental justice advisors, one of the key outcomes of that was the environmental justice measurement and evaluation framework, which helps guide our investments. And we'll talk more about that structure in a little bit. And then in 2022, we started branching out to other types of agreements. And with the developer Engie and our partner Solstice, we have some community solar offerings for low to moderate income households in Illinois. And then later, we also signed an agreement with Statkraft in Ireland. And then in 2023, we enabled a solar farm in Mississippi with Clearloop. And then we've been using these lessons learned, these projects and the lessons learned from these projects to expand our program outside the US and then also across sustainability pillars, the pillars that Anjali mentioned earlier. Next slide, please, Jenny. So in beginning our journey, as I said, we started with renewable energy, and we learned that we can tie our purchases of renewable energy to environmental justice and equitable outcomes. And we can empower under-resourced communities through the implementation of environmental justice principles. And so I'll talk a little bit about the Sol Systems and Volt case studies here. Next slide, please. So for the Volt agreement, this is a 250 megawatt power purchase agreement, and the structure of which has three main components. The first is supplier diversity. So requiring, Volt itself is an African-American owned utility or development company. And we require in the contract supplier diversity targets. The second component is habitat restoration, because healthy habitats are foundational for healthy communities. And then the third is a community fund where the PPA will direct a portion of project revenues to environmental justice projects. Volt has established a separate 501c3 registered nonprofit foundation, and that foundation will implement programs and distribute further grant funding to community-based organizations to support environmental justice outcomes. Volt also is leveraging the measurement and evaluation framework that I mentioned to guide the use of the community funds to ensure that the organizations that are benefiting truly champion environmental justice issues. Next slide, please, Jenny. So as I mentioned, one of the components of the Volt agreement was supplier diversity. And the idea here is to equitably share in the benefits of the clean energy transition. It's important to diversify the clean energy sector, so create employment opportunities for those populations who have been historically underemployed. So the way that we do that is that Sharing the Power Foundation, which is the foundation that Volt set up, can enable historically Black colleges and universities and minority serving institutions to enable diverse talent. Also, we want to, when focusing on supplier diversity, not just focus on the installation jobs or the temporary construction jobs, but also management positions and ownership positions in these companies. And then we also want to take a closer look into what are the barriers that are preventing diverse-led businesses from becoming part of the clean energy transition and address those. Next slide, please. So here is an example of how the community fund works. And there are a number of different smaller frontline community-based organizations, not just in the US, but globally, who are doing this important work. And what we wanted to do was get to those smaller organizations that don't typically receive funding. So there are a number of really wonderful global NGOs that work in environment. But when it comes to environmental justice, that is a focus that has only recently come to the attention to those large global NGOs. And what we want to do is get funding to the community-based organizations who are really working on the front lines. And so the revenue from PPAs and other types of charitable contributions go to a third-party fund manager. In the case of the Volt PPA, I mentioned that they have a Sharing the Power Foundation. As we've scaled our program and are signing more power purchase agreements, it became important to identify fund managers at the country level to ensure that the funding process is just and equitable, and it's not, a person like me at Microsoft sitting in Seattle making decisions about where funding goes, and because we want to make sure we tap into that network of community-based organizations. So in the US, we've identified Sustain Our Future Foundation, which can help disperse those community funds, leveraging the measurement evaluation framework that I mentioned, and then really enable those regionally focused opportunities with large collective impact potential environmental justice projects on the ground. And some examples of those are some clean energy investments. It could be a community center that is functions as a resilience hub during extreme weather events, a place to take shelter and charge your phone, for example. It could be capacity building for grassroots environmental justice organizations. That type of funding is really hard for those organizations to get because a lot of funding is tied to a specific project, and a project can't even get off the ground if the planning money isn't in place. So we think that's an important use case for these funds. And then also there are programs for those HBCUs, historically Black universities, and minority serving institutions to enable those students to participate in the industry and also enable those community-based environmental justice organizations. Next slide, please. So I'll share a little bit about the measurement and evaluation framework, which is publicly available. And we developed this with our partners to help us identify the most impactful projects to drive environmental justice. We also use this to evaluate project proposals related to EJ initiatives. We want to use this to communicate with partners about best practices with environmental justice. So if a partner brings us a project, the framework can illuminate areas for improvement in terms of environmental justice outcomes, and it can create that dialogue. And then also we want to have some form of accountability for implementing project outcomes, and so it can help us identify those key metrics to focus on. And it also helps us document positive outcomes to inform future EJ investment. Next slide, please. This framework was developed using some existing amazing assets, such as the Portland Clean Energy Community Benefits Fund and also the Energy Democracy Flipbook. As I mentioned, we co-created this with our environmental justice advisors, and we really tried to make the framework intuitive, adaptable for global contexts and also different project types. And we want to make sure that the information gathered to input into the framework is not overly burdensome for these smaller organizations that would receive the proposed funding. And we want the process by which this framework is used to be equitable within itself, and the selection process to be equitable. Hence why we use third-party fund managers who are rooted in these principles, such as Sustain Our Future Foundation in the US. Next slide, please. Just want to show the structure of the framework for you. So first, there's a set of prerequisites. So these questions are sort of go, no go. They must be satisfied in order to be considered an environmental justice project. Also, from there, if a project passes the prerequisites, it can then be scored. There are two major types of scorecards to be used. One is for physical assets, and that's physical infrastructure. And then the second is for readiness projects, and those are for the workforce development or capacity building I mentioned. For physical assets, there's a $100,000 US threshold to determine whether it's a small asset or a large asset. And then underlying, there is some robust guidance documentation, which has examples and things for the user to help guide them in the use of the framework. Next slide, please. I think it's important to show the prerequisites in the framework because it gives you an idea of what this framework is actually prioritizing. So first, it really prioritizes the project plan, the involvement of community perspectives and leaders in the project planning and decision making. And I would say that's one of the most important parts. Second is we want the benefits, of course, to be directed toward priority populations, and Anjali, visited that definition in the beginning of this presentation. And it's those people that are historically most under-resourced and marginalized. Third, we want to make sure that the labor for the project is compensated at least living wage levels for a sole adult. Often we find situations in the U.S. where the regulatorily mandated wage is actually less than what a living wage is for a family in the United States. And then we also want to make sure that the project outcomes include climate benefits, hence the environmental justice part of our focus here. And then we want to make sure that any for-profit partners have meaningful carbon neutrality and clean energy transition commitments, and that the project itself avoids development on culturally sensitive or ecologically important land. So there's a link here where you can access that framework. Next slide, please. So I'll end the presentation part of the webinar today, and we'll move to Q&A by with a call to action. So companies like Microsoft can leverage their procurement toward meaningful social impact on our most impacted and under-resourced communities. And the process really starts with engaging in deep learning and understanding what environmental justice is and who are the organizations and individuals that have already been doing this work for decades. The second is to engage authentically with communities, and it's important to cultivate a network of environmental justice partners that can help with that process. And then the third is to create co-benefits for under-resourced communities with these procurement motions. And then the last is to also invest in workforce development and create employment opportunities. So I see, our program is the focus is first on diversity, equity, and inclusion internally for our organization. And then we contract directly with diverse-led suppliers and require our suppliers to engage in supplier diversity in their supply chain. And this is really important for that economic inclusion part of environmental justice. You can also learn more at the paper, and as Jenny mentioned, that will be in the handout box. Right, back to you, Jenny.
All right, well, thank you so much, Danielle and Anjali, for sharing this body of work and for making these tools openly available for others to leverage as well. As Danielle mentioned, these will be in the handout box, the lessons learned paper and the slides. We have about 10 or 11 minutes for question and answers. So if you have questions, please type them into the chat box, and I will pose a few to get us started. So the first question is one that was submitted by a registrant. How do you ensure that the economic advantages reach the households and the populations that are truly in need?
Shall I go for it, Jenny?
Yeah, go for it.
Great. So to me, this is the really highlighting the importance of having environmental justice partners. These are the external organizations that help us on our learning journey, but that also help disperse those benefits. So in the context of our PPAs, when we have the community funds, in the US, we have Sustain Our Future Foundation, which help disperse those funds. And that organization is really rooted in equity and justice. And they take a network philanthropic approach. So they spend a lot of time developing relationships and being in community with those organizations that are really working on the front lines of environmental injustice. So having those right partners is very important. And then I'll also say that in the context of our NGN Solstice Community Solar that I mentioned earlier, Solstice is the entity used to administer the community solar subscriptions. And they have a unique model where they identify potential subscribers through those subscribers' participation in existing governmental programs for low to moderate income folks. And they don't overly burden those potential subscribers with a lengthy application process, and do not rely on credit scores for folks to participate, which is often a big barrier to people benefiting from community solar.
Great. I have a follow-up question. How do you find the right partners in this environmental justice space? Do you look up organizations on the internet and give them a ring? Like what does that look like?
Oh, I'd love to turn that back to you, Jenny, because I think you are actually a key partner in helping us identify the first EJ collaborators that we worked with. And I also want Anjali to chime in because she has worked in the nonprofit space before, and I know she'll have a lot to add.
Yeah, well, I can just say this is sort of a new area by which private sector entities are trying to engage with nonprofits that might have a history in this work. So it's not like other types of expertise where it's easy to find and contract with those advisors. It requires, I think, a little more trust building and almost co-creating the types of partners that you need. But having relationships with organizations that do work in this space or in community, and then treating them like other types of experts that establish mutually beneficial relationships with is important. Compensating them for their time and expertise, being transparent about your intentions and all of that good stuff. Anjali, anything to add, especially given that you've worked in nonprofits previously?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that the point, Jenny, of that a lot of this is it's super trust based, and referrals matter quite a bit for being able to sort of get an initial foot in the door. But I think your question of like, do we Google search for organizations to try to find them? I do think that there's sort of that the diligence thing that has to happen on both sides, right? We're both relying on referrals, we're relying on sort of word of mouth of which organizations to work with. Also being able to verify what sort of what work they've done in the past, and what impacts that they've had in communities that have been captured online, and using resources like GuideStar to understand their their backgrounds as a nonprofit, just as we expect they should be doing with corporate partners to make sure that they're engaging with folks who are operating in good faith. So I think it's that sort of that combination of word of mouth and then being able to do that wraparound diligence to make sure that it's the right fit.
I have one more thing to add to this question. I love it so much. Is that for the corporate side, finding the right collaborators is also about being a good partner yourself. So being trustworthy, doing what you say you're going to do, being transparent, keep showing up even when conversations get hard. And yeah, Anjali, I guess maybe you might have something to add to that as well.
No, I think that you said it really well. Showing up when the conversations get hard, and acknowledging when there are actions that that happen that that may not always align with with what the shared goals are, and being open and transparent about what's happened and how to move forward.
Oh, and also compensating your collaborators. So we get this question sometimes, and think about, as a company, what do you pay consultants to advise you on, whether it be your GHG accounting or whatever sustainability strategy? It's a very similar type of compensation. You want to compensate people for their expertise.
Okay, I'm going to throw out at least one, hopefully two more questions before we reach time here. Have you observed a change in how your business partners are considering environmental justice or ESG issues, especially given any kind of broader changes in the regulatory space?
Yeah, I think there's a couple ways to look at this question. There has been some really positive developments. I'll just center on the US first, is that the Biden administration has enabled the passing of the Inflation Reduction Act, and that has some significant provisions in it to support the build out of clean energy infrastructures and incentives for companies to help make that happen. And so we've seen an uptick in the participants and the capital flowing to those projects. There's also some political headwinds against ESG. And really what I've seen is, you have companies that are wondering what to do. Like, how do they, and there's a difference between what a company talks about publicly, either greenwashing or green hushing, which is something that I've seen where, companies are actually doing a lot of great work, but not talking about it because they don't want to be perceived negatively. And the real business reason for a company to take action in ESG, one of those big reasons, besides doing the right thing, is to support a company's social license to operate. And so pulling back on community level investments does not help infrastructure get built, or does not help a company continue to operate. So I've not seen too many actual plans derailed by any negative sentiment, any negative political headwinds against ESG.
Right, thank you for that. And I think I sort of share that perspective that, businesses, are planning over long time horizons, and they're not going to sort of fundamentally shift strategies that are aligned with their business interests just based on what the kind of broader chatter is about some of these issues, but they may change how they frame or what they kind of outwardly promote. I think, and maybe this is a good segue into a last question before we wrap up here, but what has surprised you about this effort, now coming in on 5 years into doing this, what I would say is, clearly some pioneering work in the private sector to focus on benefiting environmental justice communities? What's been surprising?
Great, I love this question. Anjali, do you want to go first, or do you want me to go?
I'm happy to jump in. I think, so I joined the Microsoft team about a year ago, and so Jenny and Danielle have been building this program for the last several. And I think what surprised me the most is how open people, not only at Microsoft, have been to this sort of way of working, but across the board. We talk to renewable energy developers, we talk to folks in other elements of our sustainability work. And when we talk about the importance of environmental justice and the importance of centering communities, I mean, there's the pushback is pretty low, and in fact, it's seen, to Danielle's point, as a really exciting way to deepen the impact of the work, to expand the social license to operate for the company, and to just make this big exciting transition that the world is going through even more impactful. So I think that's been what surprised me the most.
I share that, Anjali, and I'll just add that because of that, it's less been our job to illustrate the why of the work and more about the how. So that's really what we've been able to focus on, is like creating new models and blueprints, and we hope to continue to share with the industry in the way that we have with this paper that we'll leave behind with you today.
Oh, so great. And just to close us out, I totally agree with the sentiment of there's a lot of collaborators out there ready to kind of pick up and embrace this type of approach to sustainable infrastructure development. I think of it as sort of the opposite of diminishing returns, where you put in more effort for less output. This is putting in a little more effort, adding a little complexity to these projects and getting outsized benefit from that additional effort. And I'm so grateful to work with you all on this, and also really glad that so many of these resources are freely available, and tools, methodologies that other companies, other collaborators can pick up and move these models along in their own universes. So that is all we have time for today, and just thank you both so much for being a part of this.
Thank you. We're grateful for you, Jenny, and the rest of the WSP team.
Yes, very much so.
All right, well, thanks to the audience as well. We hope you find value in the content, and we'll try to address any questions we didn't get to in email forum as a wrap up to the session. Thank you.